Дейвид, благодаря ти, че прие моята покана за този разговор. Както знаеш, това, което ме интересува, е корупционния скандал от 2002 година. Това е времето, по което Чешката република се намираше в период на придобиване на нови бойни самолети. Би ли казал няколко думи по отношение на политическата обстановка в страната по това време? Какви са били мотивите на предстоящата сделка? Чехия да е по-близо до Русия или да е по-близо до своите съюзници от НАТО и своите партньори от Европейския съюз? Каква беше обстановката в Чехия по това време?
Thank you for having me. Well, let me give you a brief background of the story. Well, Czech Republic used to have Russian-produced technology and military technology, including jet fighters, so old MiG-21, and there was a clear need to replace them with new machines, and that was a very clear strategic objective. Well, at the same time, politically, Czech Republic was entering NATO and EU, NATO in 1999 and EU in 2004, and there was a long debate, that we should be, contribute militarily to our allies. And one of the strategic options was to buy new combat jet fighters or supersonic, so to say. Well, the debate was mainly how to do that. There were a few options. One, to buy completely new machines, which were produced by a couple of producers in the world, not many, but let's say 4 or 5. Second option was to buy already used ones. So not completely new, which would of course reduce costs, but at the same time it has other disadvantages. And the third option was to make some kind of leasing. So actually lease, jet fighters from another country, another government, another producer, and the Czech Republic would actually pay some yearly rental fees for using of those jet fighters. Mm-hmm. Well, the decision was actually made after a lot of considerations, to go with the first option to buy completely new jet fighters, and then the whole story of enormous lobbying started when the producers started to persuade Czech government to go with their option. There were Americans.
So here the whole corruption scheme starts, right?
Yeah, that's where we started. We're talking about year 2001, 2002, when the whole story emerged and started. At that time, we had a social democratic government, but then it was a few years later replaced by conservative one. So it's not as important because, unfortunately, it seemed that there was no huge difference between right or left. There was mainly difference between people who were more sensitive to those lobbying pressures and those who simply were able to negotiating and potentially take bribes. Well, most active in lobbying were Americans who were promoting F-16 and also potential lease of F-18s, but there were also French company which was offering their own machines. But it seems that the biggest appetite for this deal was from British Aerospace, Saab company, Swedish-British consortium which is producing Gripens. Mm-hmm. The trick was that at that time Gripens were not used by any other NATO country, so it would be the first one which would actually acquire Gripens, so they were not kind of tested in the real operation.
I see.
And that was one of the disadvantages, and that's what Americans actually claimed. So buy F-16s because they are already used by many NATO members.
Анализаторите смятат, че по това време грипените, притежавани от Чехия и Унгария, представляват проблем пред сигурността на НАТО, сигурността в Централна Европа, че отслабват и възпрепятстват сигурността на Военния съюз. По това време Милош Земан беше министър-председател на Чехия. А Земан, поне в медиите, е обявяван за проруски политик в Чехия. Смяташ ли, че решението на неговия кабинет може да има общо именно с това, че той е обявяван за ляв популист в медиите и за проруски настроен политик?
I tend to think that it was minor. It was less important than it seems. Of course, the different debate is about the leaning of the Czech politics towards Russia, and some of politicians who have connections there. Miloš Zeman, who is current president of the country, is definitely a very close ally to Putin. But at that time, we're talking 15 years back, the key element was political lobbying and economic diplomacy that took place, before this deal. Well, we have to realize that defense transactions are very rarely company to company or company to country. It's rather country to country or government to government deals that are being very much used by economic diplomacy. Embassies of those respective countries are very active in pursuing and contacting local officials. During that time, I remember it was like U.S. defense minister who visited Prague, and basically the objective of the visit was to persuade the government to buy F-16s. But at the same time, British Prime Minister at that time, Tony Blair, came twice to Prague to persuade the government. So it was like at that highest level, political level, that actually try to promote their to make story shorter. What happened was that the decision was taken that we will buy new weapons, new aircrafts. Then was the debate how many of them we need. Of course, logically, army generals always
insisted for more.
Lobby for more. So there was discussion between the maximum number was 30, I guess. Then in the end, the agreement was that we will buy 14 pieces, right? 14 aircrafts, which still was the biggest defense procurement at that time in terms of money. We are talking about maybe half billion euros that were involved, and it was really a huge amount of money in the game.
Okay.
Well, and now we can get into the corruption scheme.
Yeah, that was my next question. Как точно работеше тази схема?
It was actually uncovered by ironically by Swedish journalists and by Swedish television who were following British aerospace and their business practices around the world, that they actually set up branch in the Czech Republic.
Just a short note. Кратка бележка. British Aerospace е BAE Systems, компанията, която работеше заедно с САП по това време. Yeah.
And they are producers of Gripens, and they are basically covering the whole consortium. So this company actually set up a branch in Prague and sent a political lobbyist whose objective was actually to get support for this deal. Why was it important? Because it was not just the government, the cabinet that would decide it, but because it exceeded the costs, or it needed also parliament's approval, right? So they needed also generate political support among members of parliament, and that's why they actually contacted different political parties and groupings and individual MPs. What they found was that this branch of British Aerospace, BAE Systems, actually generated black funds, of billions of Czech crowns that were actually used for some hidden payments or to motivate Czech politicians to agree with this deal. Well, the Swedish reporters actually used hidden cameras, and they were actually following some of the case studies. So they pretended that they are military contractors, and they are negotiating with Czech politicians, including former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Kava, and others. And they, to finish this story, this sentence, they were kind of open to any kind of negotiations. They were open to any offer of expensive trips, and they showed that it's so easy to bribe them, to put it in very simple terms, right?
So it's not... Така че тези твърдения не почиват върху просто един човек ми каза, а върху сериозно журналистическо разследване, което е разкрило цялата схема. Така ли?
Yeah. What is ironic that the story which was about Czech money and Czech budget was uncovered by Swedish journalists, right? It was not that the Czech journalists would start the story. Of course, Czech media took over later and they tried to develop the story and follow what happened further. But it needs to be said that the Swedish journalists, they were following also acquisitions of Gripens in other countries, including some European places, like Hungary, later Austria, but also outside of Europe, like Tanzania, South Africa, Brazil, and others. And later on, it was actually discovered and documented that British Aerospace had a policy to actually bribe abroad to get government contracts. They had a massive, black account schemes, which was investigated by British Serious Fraud Office. British Aerospace and their managers were, investigated, and it led, few years later to settlements where the British Aerospace had to pay enormous fine to settle the case.
Sorry to interrupt you. Защитниците на Грипен обаче могат да кажат, че всичко това беше направено от британците. То няма нищо общо с шведите, то няма нищо общо с компанията СААП и така нататък. Знаеш ли нещо повече за това, как точно тези две компании са функционирали помежду си? Какви са били взаимоотношенията им? Въпросът е, можем ли да кажем, че само британците са виновни, а представителите на Грипен са невинни и са чисти като утринна роса?
It's not an easy question, because honestly, it's in this business dealings, they have a very smart web of interactions. But the point is that simply they had a joint venture between SAP and British Aerospace, which was actually to produce and then to sell these weapons, these aircrafts. And since the investigation was led also in Sweden and also in UK about on the management of it, and it was clearly documented that the policy of black funds, bribes, and kickbacks was actually approved not only in the UK but also in Sweden.
Okay, I see.
I don't think you can actually argue that someone was actually clean and had no idea what's happening, and they simply didn't know.
Let's go to Prague at that time. Нека да се върнем в Прага по това време. Според репортажи в медиите, прокурора на Прага, Властимил Рампула, е бил отстранен от Върховния административен съд заради това, че не си е свършил работата качествено при разследването. Дали става дума за политическа протекция или става дума за обикновена небрежност от страна на разследващия прокурор? What's your input on that?
That's a more local story. Of course, the quality of public prosecution and independence of public prosecutors was an enormous issue on which was really important in many cases, not only Gripens and not only military acquisitions. This guy who was at the top of the Prague public prosecutor's office, which is really like the key office within public prosecution in the country, initially, he had a very good reputation as a professional and independent guy, but it seemed that he was simply put and lobbied heavily by local, as we call them, political entrepreneurs and local political lobbyists. It was never uncovered that he would be corrupt directly, right? But his connections to brokers and power brokers was so close that he actually lost confidence that he is independent. And in this particular case of Gripens, the negligent actions, or simply that they in some of the individual investigations, they, for instance, missed the deadlines that were needed to follow up with investigations, actually caused that at the end of the day, in Czech judiciary, no one was actually punished for this huge corruption scheme in Prague.
I see.
And I think he was one of the reasons and culprits of that. And that was one of the reasons why he had to be dismissed. And it's, and that's the end of the story. But like, my interpretation would be that the negligence was actually very much intentional.
I see. So, ще се опитам още малко да те накарам да говориш политически. По време на тези обществени поръчки и в Чехия, и в Унгария управляват съответно в Унгария партията Фидес, считана за крайно дясна, за дясна популистка партия на Виктор Орбан, а в Чехия управляват социал-демократите на Земан, който е определен като ляв популист и проруски настроен политик. Така че и в Чехия, и в Унгария управляват съответно крайно лява или лява популистка партия и крайно дясна популистка партия, а пък в крайна сметка решенията, които взимат, са изцяло в услуга на руската геополитическа стратегия и в вреда на НАТО. Във вреда също така и на Европейския съюз. Как би коментирал това?
Again, difficult question because like also politically these parties evolve, right? So Fidesz of 2004 is different party than the Fidesz of 2019. The same with Czech Social Democrats or Miloš Zeman in the Czech context. And also Russian political involvement into Europe is at the different scale that it was 15 years ago.
Okay.
Another aspect is that of course like in itself, having and using Gripens is not necessarily militarily completely wrong decision, right? They seem to be compatible at the moment with a NATO system. Well, when I talk to people, to pilots who use them, or I had a chance to talk to them, so they basically have no complaints about the quality of aircraft. They were used also by the Czech army for protection, for instance, of Baltic states because they don't have machinery these days. Well, so Gripens are now part of a NATO, like a military composition, so to say.
I see.
But at that time, it was not the case, right? And the whole story was mainly about political lobbying between Americans, British and Swedes, and some others, perhaps and French, who wanted to take part as well, and the methods which were used to actually get the political will, and these methods were clearly corrupt, right? That's unfortunate. The Russian involvement was probably visible later, but like I wouldn't say that it has a lot of impact on the country, not only here but also Hungary in my reading. But I wouldn't link it necessarily to this particular deal and corruption to there.
So, спомнеш ли си, би ли могъл да разкажеш какво в крайна сметка се случи? Какъв беше крайният резултат от разследването? Крайният резултат от журналистическите разкрития. Аз имам спомен, че британския офис по тежките измами се е взел със случая. В Щатите имаше разследване. В крайна сметка, какви са твоите спомени за резултата от това разследване?
Well, on global level, British aerospace was actually found guilty for having black funds and using bribery and corruption in different countries. They had to make settlements in the US and in the UK. They had to pay a huge fine, and it was a huge reputation blow up, for them as a company. Locally, there were investigations in each individual country, including Czech Republic and Hungary, but there were no judicial outcomes. So no one was found guilty. No one was actually convicted, and that is a sad story about the quality of our judiciary and investigations. But also, it's ironic because, if these global corporations, agree on settlements, then the money is going to UK or American budget, not to Czech or Hungarian one, right? But the Czechs or Hungarians paid for the jet fighters and paid some extra costs which were not necessary.
Излиза, че един път една държава си плаща за корупционната схема, а втори път друга държава получава пари от глоба по тази корупционна схема.
And that's what can happen in any other country, including Bulgaria potentially, because it's some kind of an extra tax that you pay for corruption, right? So that's one part. Of course, locally, it had an effect on the discussion about how to change the acquisition process at the Ministry of Defense, right? Because it was such a huge case. The corruption charges and corruption suspicion was so strong that it was clearly discussed that we need to make more accountable acquisition process. Honestly, it still have major loopholes, but I think this Gripen case to some extent contributed to improvement of it, right? So that's a positive story, and basically that through scandals you can actually reach potential policy changes.
И наистина последния ми въпрос. Казваш, че няма, аз бих казал за съжаление, че няма нито един осъден чешки политик по този корупционен скандал. Как мислиш, дали причината за това не се крие в простото твърдение, че те са прекалено големи, за да се провалят?
In terms of business connections, definitely, right? So even if you look at the companies, you see that they always end up in settlements and not in some kind of bankruptcy or insolvency.
Exactly.
In terms of political players, of course, individual, it led to the highest level of government, right? Including Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, or key members of parliament who could influence decision of parliament on this deal. So they were probably too powerful to fail. There were huge grips over prosecution office. Unfortunately, at that time, it looked like that whenever judiciary touches someone who is politically or business-wise strong enough, then they are kind of untouchable, right? That was situation 2002, 2007, 2008 in this country. Of course, 10 years later, situation is different, and we had a few high-level convictions, and Prime Minister had to resign because of corruption, and these stories happen. But 10 years ago, it was very rare and almost uncommon. And lastly, the lesson was about the quality of investigative journalism as well, because this story, as I said, was initiated by Swedish. It showed that without enough resources and enough time, those investigative journalists cannot actually uncover this international corruption, right? Because they had to travel from Stockholm to London, from London to Prague to Budapest, and they had to use some devices that are can be expensive, and they need time. So we had a discussions, like what can be done actually to improve quality of investigative journalism. Again, it's far from perfect, but I believe it also contributed to certain improvements.
Okay.
And now you see that like sometimes there are some international teams being formed in order to follow those international corruption cases, and that's another lesson that to go over. And finally, of course, like public perception is that when we talk about Gripens, so of course no one remembers the details, but they all say like, wow, Gripens equals corruption.
I see.
In the Czech context. And that was a huge blow up that we all knew that like bribes were running from here there. And I believe that that's of course like we need to avoid in the future, because like military acquisitions are always sensitive, are always a lot of security measures take place. As I said, it's government to government business usually, but we need to avoid that every other military transaction is being perceived as a corrupt deal and basically misuse of money.
Okay, thank you very much. This was David Ondračka, investigative journalist from Czech Republic. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.